Do you believe the souls of the dead may reside in their designated tombs? Would the dead care whether his or her tomb be well taken care of or not? Traditionally, Koreans put particular emphasis in funeral, burial, and memorial culture. It has very close correlation to the patriarchal culture that grew stronger towards the end of Joseon dynasty. But anyway, in practice, from the selection of the burial plot to burial ceremony to proper care of the tombs down the generations, every step had to stick to proper procedures. In Confucian morality, that was the way to pay respect to your family lineage. But in more spiritual or, shall I say, superstitious sense, it was thought to be the way to appease to your ancestors for the greater prosperity of the family clan. That meant, on the flip side, if the tombs are not properly taken care of, it could upset those who are buried there. Sadly, tombs getting abandoned or forgotten is not so uncommon. The family clan might die down, the family fortune could wane, or simply the descendants might get lazy. I mean, how many of you know where your great-grandparents are buried after all, let alone regularly visit to take care of their tombs? Today, we are taking a look at stories regarding abandoned tombs and potentially angry souls hanging around them. Most of them are a bit ambiguous, and we can't tell for sure if the weird sightings and incidents around them were really to do with the upset souls buried in the tomb in question. But it definitely shows the perception in Korean culture that the dead do care about the condition of their tombs. By the way, I already discussed about various aspects of Korean funeral, burial, and memorial culture in my past episodes. If you missed them, I'll leave the links to relevant episodes in the description. So, here are 4 allegedly true stories about the angry souls in the abandoned tombs. As always, handpicked, translated, and narrated by host, Anthony. It's some 40-year-old story. My grandpa was a farmer all his life. He had 6 children, and my dad was his 5th child. And this happened in one spring when Dad was 13. He came back home later than usual after having fooled around with friends after school. To his surprise, his home was empty, which by that time of the hour should usually be bustling with 5 siblings back from school, his mom cooking dinner, and his dad turning in to the evening news. Not only that, Dad quickly noticed the cow was also missing from the barn. Now, it was still time before all the farming machines and tractors, and a cow was an essential workforce in farming. It going missing was not a small matter at all. What happened before Dad came back home was, the ground of the barn was usually covered with dry straws for the comfort of the cow and the hygiene of the barn. It had to be replaced regularly, and earlier in the afternoon, Grandpa and 2 of the oldest uncles were doing exactly that. The cow was tied to the barn post, and yet somehow it escaped through the barn door that was left opened to bring in the fresh straws. It wasn't even the tie was broken or undone. Grandpa and all his sons were seasoned farm workers, and there was no chance that they would make such a basic mistake. The cow was a gentle and well-trained one, but that day the cow kept running away slowly, just enough to escape the hands trying to catch its bridle. When my dad heard Grandpa shouting from the field and ran out, indeed, his entire family was there and running about to catch their precious animal that was going further and further away into the mountain. That part of the mountain was private ground, but there was more to why it became almost a taboo among villagers to trespass there. The owner of the land was the richest family in the area. They ruined their generation's old reputation by willingly collaborate to the Japanese authority during the colonial time. The tension between the family and other villagers grew and grew and came to the breaking point after the independence, to the tragic end of the begrudged villager killing a young daughter of the rich family. The rumor was that the dead girl was buried on the slope of the mountain, and ever since, villagers avoided passing there, a painful scar from the painful chapter of the history. And Grandpa's cow now went in there. So Dad's older brothers went around the other side of the slope, while Grandpa, Dad, and his younger brother waited at the front in case the cow turned back. Dad, who either didn't know or care about the taboo, wanted to just follow the cow into the slope, but Grandpa stopped him furiously. The hunt started at dusk, and now it was pitch dark, with no street lamps or any source of light all around. They heard a cow mooing loudly, echoing around the forest. It carried on for a good few minutes, and with that, Dad's younger brother started crying. Dad heard his older brother shouting from the other side, and few minutes later, two older brothers appeared leading the cow behind. What should have been the moment of relief quickly turned to that of a panic. Younger brother's cry turned to a fit, and Grandpa and Dad also lost words, because they all saw on the back of their cow a girl laughing and giggling. It was only later that the younger brother explained that he saw the girl already the moment the cow mooed, threatening them not to trespass her ground. The older brothers didn't see her at all, and Grandpa and Dad also only caught the glimpse of her for a few seconds. But the younger brother insisted that she rode on the cow all the way back home. That it was why he couldn't stop crying and spitting swear words. It's the story Grandpa told me when I visited him. I don't know if he was serious or just meant to scare me with a false story, but when I later asked Dad about it, he too had a faint memory of the day. Indeed, I did see a tomb on the slope myself, now surrounded by a rusty fence and seemingly long forgotten, hidden behind wild grass. I want to start my story by saying that it all really happened to me. I'm a heavy-duty vehicle driver. A big part of my job is transporting basic building materials such as sand, stones, and rebars to a remote island off the west coast. For such a task, timing is everything. The West Sea is shallow, and the difference that tides in and out makes is huge. On a low tide, the sea can get so shallow that boats get stuck, and one can get stuck at the port for at least a few hours, just looking at the water. Since my work schedule has to follow the time of the tides, I often end up working late at night. That day last November was the same. By the time I was back to the mainland from the island, it was 3 a.m. The November night was unseasonably cold. It probably was the gusts from the sea, but it was cold enough to make my teeth clatter. As soon as my lorry hit the dry land, I quickly hit my way back. The road was unpaved, and the shipbuilding yard with no lights on looked eerie, but it only made me speed up to get out of there sooner. But when I turned the sharp corner out of the shipyard, there was a cat in the middle of the road. I knew it was too late to avoid, and just prayed that the cat be quick and nimble enough to avoid the inevitable. But it was in vain. I felt the little bump from the back wheel. I turned the lorry around to look what happened in the headlights. A cat must have hit at its hind legs. It was dragging itself away painfully. It must mean a sure death if I left it behind. I got off and chased after the cat, but it only seemed to make the cat move away even faster. But then, should I stop, thinking maybe I couldn't catch up, the cat would also stop and looked back at me over its shoulder. Then, when I take a few steps towards, again the cat moved away exactly that same distance. I felt a sudden chill and looked around. I could see the light from my lorry between tree branches a few meters below. I was confused. I thought I took barely a few steps, and we seemed to be already in the halfway up a low mountain. Something wasn't right. I left the cat behind that was looking back at me and ran back to my car. Back in the safety of inside of the lorry, I thought maybe I was overthinking. I turned my car and its headlights towards the mountain slope to check on the cat one more time. But the cat wasn't there, but on the flat land not far from the lorry. It was looking back at me over its shoulder, as if insisting that I carry on following it. It was impossible. I ran down the slope as fast as I could. A severely wounded cat couldn't have caught up with me so quickly. I quickly drove off and got the hell out of there. About a fortnight later, I was on the same route at about the same time. By then, I almost forgot about the cat incident. I checked the time. It was 3 a.m. The narrow road between rice fields was empty. I put on the radio and whistled along the song they played to chase drowsiness away. Then I saw the back of an old lady walking along the road. At 3 a.m? She looked a perfectly normal country granny working on a farming field. Her head wrapped with a towel, simple white top and baggy comfy trousers. Maybe she couldn't sleep and decided to start the day. My lorry ran past her, and a few seconds later I took a glimpse of the rear view mirror to check on her. My heart skipped a beat. She was definitely walking in the same direction as my lorry just a second ago, and now she was walking away to the opposite direction. She was dragging her right foot, and then looked back at me over her shoulder, just as the cat from the other night. I don't know how I drove all the way back home that night. I just cried and shouted like a madman all the way. The following day, I sought an old captain who lived his whole life in that village. I asked if there lived an old lady with a leg issue, but he said there wasn't any. I then explained what happened from the day I ran over the cat, and the captain changed the color of his face. Up on the very mountain where the cat tried to lure me to is an old tomb that nobody seemed to know to whom it belonged to, not even the 70-year-old captain himself. I still have to pass that road regularly. Fortunately, nothing more weird happened to this day, but I still get chills whenever I pass there. What was that cat trying to lure me to the mountain for? Could it really have something to do with a tomb? It's a story I heard from my grandma, as happened to Grandpa when he was young. I couldn't have it confirmed by Grandpa himself because he passed away shortly after I was born. It goes back to the 1930s, the last harsh years on the Japanese occupation. Grandpa had a gang of friends from the same village, and they often gathered and spent time at a little pavilion in the middle of the orchard, basically a humble thatched hut from which the owner could watch over his orchard for a theft. That day too, Grandpa and his gang got tipsy on rice wine and went to hang around the pavilion late afternoon. Strange thing was that Grandpa dozed away fast as soon as they got there. His friends tried to wake him up, but he was out completely. And in the end, they just left him behind and went back home. They all lived nearby, and they thought nothing much could happen to him in the warm summer evening. It was with a strange chill that Grandpa finally woke up. He found himself all alone at the pavilion. It was already dark. Unusually thick fog was all around, and it felt unseasonably chilly, almost cold. "That bastard's left me behind," Grandpa thought, but didn't really panic. He was in his own village, and the way from the pavilion to his home he had taken thousands of times. He nonchalantly peed on the side, even picked up a couple of melons from the field for a snack, and took his way back home. The problem was, he couldn't reach home. Usually 10-15 minutes walk would have been enough. Could he have lost in that fog? What really started unnerving him was that the surrounding felt all too strange and unfamiliar. He heard elderly villagers talking about when a ghost tricks one. One thinks one is going somewhere, but it actually walks on and on in a loop. Grandpa stopped and tried to think clearly. But then, somewhere far away behind the fog, he heard a bell ringing. Its particular ring sounded familiar. Where had he heard it before? Could it be? He got chills. He hid into the nearest bush on the side of the road and peeped out. He couldn't be sure if this was what he thought it was, and had to find out. The sound of the bell got closer, and as it got closer, he heard other sound too, which made it clear that it was the sound of a funeral march. Funeral march at night? There was no way that one would choose to bury a dead at night. Grandpa didn't even dare to breathe hard and watched on. And indeed, through the thick fog appeared a coffin carried out, led by a guy ringing the bell. It looked like any old traditional funeral march, except there was nobody following the coffin. It passed the bush where Grandpa was hiding and slowly disappeared into the fog again. Grandpa waited till he couldn't hear the sound anymore, then jumped out and ran. It all felt too weird now, and all he could think about was to go back home as soon as possible. But it wasn't to be. The way seemed to lead him further and further into a mountain, until he reached a tomb. It looked new too, with no grass growing on its mound. Then something hit the back of Grandpa's head hard, and he passed out. Whilst he was out, he had a dream, a very vivid dream. It seemed to be at least more than 100 years back. He was witnessing a guy interrogated and accused of something in the courtyard of the regional governor. The accused was tortured mercilessly, spanked, fire-stamped, legs twisted, and after all that, his fate seemed to be sealed. An executioner was brought in. He danced around with his big heavy sword, and a moment came. The sword cut the man's head clean. The decapitated head flew straight towards Grandpa, with its lips grinning ear to ear. Grandpa woke up with a scream. The sun was up already, but the forest above him was so dense that hardly any light reached down. Still, there was enough light for him to make out that he was next to a tomb. It must have been long abandoned, and it was covered with weeds. Otherwise, it was a dense forest and bushes all around that he couldn't imagine how he got there the previous night in the first place. When he barely reached home, his mom grabbed him in her arms and cried, "Where have you been? Where have you been? We thought we lost you." Turned out, he had gone missing 3 days. When Grandpa recounted what happened, nobody knew what to make of it. Nobody in the village even heard of such a tomb existed. By the time he recounted it to Grandma, he wasn't sure himself if it were all just a bad dream or not. I don't have religion, and am largely undecided about the existence of gods and spirits. All I can say for sure is what I've experienced for myself, and these are my true experiences. I was born and grew up in Seoul, but after some serious conflicts in the baseball club in my primary school, I decided to move to a country village, leaving everything behind. The house I stayed was well hidden away in the mountains, away from the main village. Mom would come and visit me once a month until I started middle school, when she came to stay with me there too. For the first 2 years, I cooked and took care of myself all alone and walked back and forth between the school and home. On the way linking the backyard to the mountain were a couple of old tombs, seemingly abandoned. About in the second year in the middle school, some people finally turned up for one of those tombs to cut grass and offer some food for the dead. Late the same day, I woke up in the middle of the night to pee. Still feeling groggy, I couldn't be bothered to go all the way to the privy that was sitting outside, so I just stepped out to the backyard. There were no street lamps in the whole area, but the full moon was shining bright enough for me to see everything. And in that moonlight, I saw an old man wearing a humble traditional dress, devouring the food offered to the grave. I wasn't quite sure what was going on and simply asked, who are you?" The old man turned around and grinned. Out of habit, because I was told to be polite to the elderly, I muttered, "Good evening." But I quickly realized there weren't people I didn't know in the small village, and wondered what this strange man was doing here. Then my attention was distracted because my puppy came to me. When I petted the puppy and stood up again, the old man was gone. I thought about the possibility of it being a ghost, but I was tired and just went back to bed. Next morning, remembering what I saw at night, I went up to the tomb and found the food offered the day before was still untouched, nothing out of place. One interesting thing was my puppy, usually obsessed with food, wouldn't come close to the offerings. Later I told Mom what I saw, but she calmly said, "Practically a neighbor living in our backyard. He should be a guardian angel for you." Funnily enough, I also get involved with the other tomb at the back of the house. Years later, and it was summer in the last year of my high school. I was by then back in Seoul, but came back in the country house to find a place to study in peace during the summer vacation. About 5 days into the sojourn, for some reason I couldn't concentrate on my work. It must have been about 9 p.m., and I got out to get some fresh air, when I noticed noise from the back of the house, on the road leading to the mountain. It was a moonless night, so I picked up a lantern and approached the road. I could make out a blurry white figure about 20 meters away. I directed the light towards it, and now I could clearly see someone wearing white traditional dress walking up to the mountain, very slowly. I shouted, "Who is it there?" At which the person turned around. It was an old lady. Closer I approached, the clearer her features became, too clear to be a ghost. But what an old lady was doing at this time of the day, in such a random part of the village? I inquired her further. It was hard to understand what she said, but I understood enough that she was going to visit her daughter. Wherever the daughter's place was, there was no way she could walk alone so late at night. It was summer, but late night in the mountain can get dangerously cold. I persuaded her to come to my place with a promise I'd find the daughter for her. After putting her in bed, I ran to the house of the head of the village. He came back to my place, but he didn't know who the old lady was either. He suggested that I let her stay overnight and let her go in the morning, but I insisted to try and dig deeper as the lady was clearly suffering dementia or Alzheimer's. Fortunately, the lady could clearly recall the name of her children, which finally seemed to have ringed a bell to the leader of the village. He asked her if they were from the village nearby, and indeed they were. He hopped on his bike to fetch the leader of the neighboring village. Fortunately, he knew who the family was, and after a few rounds of phone calls, the old lady's son and grandson drove over at 1 a.m. to pick her up. Meanwhile, I got to learn the backstory. The lady used to live in the neighboring village. Her daughter sadly died young after her marriage, and the grave back of my place belonged to her. The lady adored the daughter, and it left a big scar to her. But now, living with her son away in a bigger town, the daughter's grave had been, as I noted, more or less abandoned. Recently, the lady's Alzheimer got worse, and would often try to run away, saying that she was going to visit her daughter. And that morning too, while her family was a bit lax, she escaped again. I have no idea however she managed to come all this way. Her son and grandson seemed nice people. They'd been searching for her frantically all day long and thanked me profusely. As they got ready to start with the lady in haste, I suggested them to visit the grave of the lady's daughter, as it was very close. While the family carrying the old lady to the grave, I quickly fetched a bottle of alcohol and a glass to aid their little ceremony in the morning. It was sad to watch the old lady keep nagging when she was going to see her daughter all the while. Before they finally drove off, the lady took out some banknotes and candies from the inner pocket. I politely refused, but in the end accepted them because the lady said, When am I going to ever see you again? Take it. Next day, I bought some fruit, dried fish, and a bottle of rice wine. I went to the daughter's grave to trim outgrown grass and offer the food and drink I brought. I used the occasion to take care of the other grave from the earlier story too. Till then, I had never thought other people's tombs would have all such stories. Anyway, season turned to winter, and I was back in Seoul. One day, I saw the old lady in my dream with another woman whom I could not recognize. She said, "Thank you. Have a good journey," and threw grains of rice and gold coins to me. I woke up and wondered if the lady had passed away. At the end of the year, I got a good result from SAT, and everything was going swimmingly. Mom, who had visited a house in the country, came back with the news that the daughter's tomb had been exhumed. The old lady passed, and the family decided to bury them together. That confirmed what my dream was about. About 2 years later, I had myself burnt out a bit from too much work, so came down to the country house with my mother. One day I was taking a walk around the house and saw the old lady standing there. Before I could react to anything, I noticed her angry expression, as if I'd done something wrong. I got a bad feeling and rushed back home and found Mom in the kitchen. And in the dark corner of the kitchen was a dangerous, venomous snake. I got Mom out of the kitchen and tried to chase the snake away from the kitchen, but for some reason, this snake tried viciously to attack me, and I had to, in the end, kill it with a broomstick. I haven't seen the old lady again. I'm just grateful that she came to warn me before the potential disaster. Hi, it's Anthony here, and thank you very much for listening. I hope you enjoyed today's stories. I have to mention the whole elaborate burial and memorial culture is a part of the dying culture in modern Korea. The family dynamic changed, and also realistically, not many can afford a sophisticated burial plot either. By today, about 60% of people choose cremation in Korea, and I wonder how the souls should react now that there's no tomb to hang around. I always think paranormal is the reflection of the world we live in, but it's an interesting subject to think about, how the changes in culture and lifestyle should affect the paranormal worldview too. If you enjoyed my work, please give it a big thumbs up and a comment, and please consider subscribing to my channel if you haven't yet. If you'd support me more directly, I have a Buy Me a Coffee account, the link's in the description, or there's also a Super Thanks option here on YouTube for a small donation. Thank you. Until next Sunday, stay safe and take care.